Hello everybody, I'm International Master Sopiko Gormishvili here for you on Chess24. The Candidates Tournament 2018 has started with an unexpected first round, 3 wins and just 1 draw. To be honest with you, I expected a slow start with 4 draws, but I was very wrong. I thought that players need to warm up a little bit. It's a very long tournament, 14 rounds, but I was pleasantly surprised to see a big fight from the very first round. For this video, I chose to cover the game of Levon Aronian against Ding Liren. A very sharp game with complicated positions, unusual opening, which I love to share with you. If you want to see the game of Fabiano Caruana versus Wesley So, then you should definitely check the video of Chess24 star Mr. Jan Gustafsson gives an amazing deep analysis about the game of Fabiano Caruana versus Wesley So. So it's highly recommended and it's a must to check that video. For now, I'm going to show you what happened in the game of Levon Aronian against Ding Liren. They both qualified from the World Cup. The finals was Levon Aronian against Ding Liren. Levon doesn't have that great score against Ding. He has -2 in classical games, but he did manage to beat him in the tie breaks. The classical games, 4 classical games in the World Cup finals were drawn, and he did manage to beat Ding in the tie breaks. So this was a very interesting game to follow. Levon started with the English c4, knight f6, knight c3, e6, e4, d5. This position they had in the tie-break game of the finals. Levon chose to play their c takes d5, e takes d5, e5 and knight e4, but this time he played right away e4 without taking on d5. Although I should mention that nowadays it's more common to take the d5 pawn first rather than playing e5 first. e5, d5, e takes f6, d takes c3, b takes c3, queen f6. This is a very known position for Levon as he's playing this from both sides, with white and with black as well. Here we have 2 main moves, knight f3 or d4, which was played in the game. Knight f3 just delays d4 for a bit. He can transpose into same positions with d4, or it gives an advantage that he can choose another plan instead of d4. So after d4, b6, this was played in the game of Aronian-Ding Liren. Levon himself played e5, which is main move in this position, but nowadays b6 became more popular. After e5, knight f3 and knight c6, this was the game between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave against Aronian in Beijing 2014. E takes d4 is tiny bit risky after bishop g5, queen e6, bishop e2, d takes c3 is not possible because of the mate on d8. And if you're not gonna keep this pawn, extra pawn, then of course after c takes d4, white will have a very big, they are ahead in development, and they have white has very nice center. But in the game of Aronian, he chose to go for knight c6, and it was very sharp after bishop g5, queen g6, d5, knight b8, h4, and here he went e4 against Maxime in 2014 Beijing, but he chose to go knight d7 against Grishuk, also in 2014 in Stavanger. So Levon is a big expert of these positions from both sides, But the move that was chosen in the game, which we are looking now, is b6. After b6, it is very common to play bishop e2, just developing your pieces, and after bishop b7, bishop f3, knight takes f3, bishop d6, queen a4, c6, and castle. This was the game which was played in 2017 Grand Prix Series in Mallorca against Ding. Svidler played it against Ding, and the game finished in a draw. It is very surprising to see that many players choose to play this type of opening against Ding Liren. But after b6, what made me very happy during commentary, as you know, we were covering this game and all first round with Mr. Jan Gustafsson. I was very happy and optimistic when I saw the move h4 by Levon Aronian. I love this kind of moves which directly tells you that, you know, I'm aggressive today, I'm gonna beat you. That's probably a bit exaggerated, but h4 is definitely a very interesting move. The idea is, of course, to get the bishop to g5 and annoy the queen on f6. After after h4, we considered two moves as main moves. One is bishop b7 to allow bishop g5, and another one which I think is very interesting is h6. Would you play bishop g5 again or not? This was the question that Jan asked me during the commentary. And the idea of bishop g5 is, of course, that if black wants to take it and not play queen f5, after hg, it seems like that if queen g5 happens, then black is losing this rook on h8. So it is bad for black. But after hg, black can sacrifice the queen. Rook h1, g takes f6, rook g1, queen f3. We need this queen to get into the game. c6 is not also great for black. So after c6, f takes g7, bishop takes g7, and the move I suggested during commentary was queen g3, with the idea of queen h2 and winning this rook on g1. Though, after analyzing this game and having the strong engine on, I found out that queen g3 is not best move in this position. It is not good move because it allows a very strong bishop a6. Black does not care about the bishop on g7. If bishop f6 was played or any other move to defend the bishop, then my idea of catching this rook with queen h2 would be great. But the problem is that after queen g3, bishop a6, we would have a nasty pin after bishop c4, and this guy on f1 would be in trouble. If we take on g7, bishop c4, long castle, bishop, rook f1, take, and bishop f1. It is true that black is not developed yet, but the compensation for the queen is pretty fine. 2 pieces and a rook. Black still needs to develop and get coordinated, but I don't think just one queen can annoy black so much. But after bishop g7, white does have a very strong breakthrough in the center, and it is d5. What is the idea of d5? Black is not yet developed and the pieces are on their starting positions. And if we open this diagonal h1, a8 diagonal, it would mean that not only this rook is in trouble, but black would have trouble to defend the a8 rook as well. So after d5, bishop d7 looks pretty logical, but let's see what would happen if black chose to take the d5 pawn, and instead of bishop d7 play cd5, cd5 and bishop a6. Is not it the same? Didn't black want to win this bishop on f1? Well, of course he did, but the problem is that the king, black king, will be in the center, and then if black king is weak, queen is very powerful. Castle, rook f1, d takes f6. If, let's say, rook d1, then after king takes d1, the problem is that now white has white is attacking the a8 rook as well, and the f7 pawn as well. So black cannot do anything about it, and it is true that black has a lot of material now, 3 pieces and a rook, but the rook will be lost after, let's say, f takes e6, queen a8, bishop e5 to defend the knight and not lose it, but after queen a7 all pawns will be lost, and this is definitely not good position for black. It is lost actually. So after bishop d7, white goes now queen g3. It was very hard for me to understand the subtlety of this position. First queen g3. Why queen g3 now? What changed so much? Why he cannot play the same? Because the bishop is already on d7, so there is no, there is no bishop a6, bishop c4 anymore. After queen g3, we still have a big threat of queen h2 and to grab this rook on g1. Now, if black wants to hide the bishop on f8, not to have any checks, then after queen h2, black would take on f1, king f1, and knight a6. This would be, I would consider as a compensation for black, but white should not hurry. Instead of queen h2, he can go queen c7, and the idea of this is that white blocks every piece of black. Now the threat is of course queen b7, and we still want to bother this rook on a8, for example, if rook h1 is played, not to have any other, not to think about queen h2 anymore. Then after queen b7, black loses another rook. So after queen c7, what can be done is cd5. Queen b7 now would be very bad because of bishop c6, but after cd5, we can take on cd5 and allow knight a6, queen b7, rook c8, or we can definitely go queen b7 and after bishop c6, play queen c8. A very annoying check after king e7, rook d1, all pieces in the center. Black cannot take on c4 because of queen d8 mate. And we can see that it's very difficult for black to develop. He cannot play knight d7 because c6 bishop is hanging. If he wants to get back in the play with rook h1, then after rook d3 or cd5, but rook d3 is very pretty idea. Let's say rook h8, then after queen c7 check, knight d7, we know that the bishop is hanging here, but after king e8, cd5, ed5 would not be good because now we have rook on third rank and we can give a check. And if bishop d5, then after rook d5, e d5, queen b7, again loses the rook on the a8. Or we can even give a mate with bishop b5, knight d7, and queen d7. So this is what happens after bishop f8. If black wants to play more active and have the bishop on f6 and allow some annoying checks on the 8th rank, then white would ignore it just and he would castle. After castling, rook h1 once again to avoid any queen h2 is now possible because the idea is to give mate queen g8 and d6. Very pretty mate, if you ask me. Long castle helps the d pawn to move. That is why after long castle, c takes, d5 should be played, c d5 and e d5, because there is a same threat of queen g8 and d6. So e d5 should be played, but after e d5, rook e1 check is very annoying for black, which means that white has a very big advantage. So after queen g3, none of bishop f8 or king or bishop f6 help. This was the line which I wanted to show you what would happen if black sacrificed this bishop, the queen. After bishop g5, we were looking at hg. But of course, after bishop g5, black can go queen f5, ignoring that he could take the bishop on g5, and after queen f5, bishop d3, queen a5, bishop d2, bishop d7, we would get this position pretty similar to what happened in the game, but the concession would be that the pawn is already on h6 and not on h7. King f1, knight d7, queen c2, bishop d6, rook h3, and castle. This is the position which could happen in the game. Castle is pretty dangerous, I thought, during the commentary, because all our pieces are looking at the king side and g4 is coming, but the bishop on d6 is very good. It controls the b8, h2 diagonal, so we cannot get any rook g3 and any attack going. And if g5, h5 is played, and what black wants is to annoy white in the center, playing rook a e8 with the ideas of e5. Our king on f1 is not ideal as well, and we still need to do something about this knight on g1. So the position is very complicated, very double-edged, and it is about the taste. If you were to choose here white, then good luck. You have to be very energetic and you have to attack. But if you want to choose here black, you have to be a bit careful with your king, and you have to find the counterplay in the center as well. Okay. Instead of bishop g5, of course, after h6, white can go something slow like bishop e2, and this would be transposing into the main lines with h4, h6. It is pretty difficult to understand for whom it is favorable to have h4, h6 included, but after bishop b7, bishop f3, and knight c6, bishop e3, e5, the position is very playable for both sides. This is all about h6, but after h4, Ding Liren chose to play bishop b7. After bishop g5, queen f5, of course not queen g6, because the queen is much worse on g6 if it's not losing directly. After bishop d3, f5 you don't want to make, and bishop e4 does not help, because after h5, if queen g5, bishop e3, c6, queen f3, this pawn is lost on c6, And if not, and queen f5, then we have the g pawn. So we should play g4, force black queen to take on g5, bishop e4, c6, and same idea, queen f3. Black can do nothing about this c6 pawn. King d7 is not possible because f7 pawn is hanging and black is just losing this pawn. So after bishop g5, queen f5 was played, bishop d3, queen a5, and king f1. King f1, I think, is pretty logical because you have to choose between the pawns, which pawns you want to give. After queen a5, white cannot defend both pawns. Bishop g2 and queen c3 is black can play these two moves, and I think that knight e2 is worse than king f1 because after bishop g2, rook g1, bishop b7, I don't see anything for white. Although after queen a5, king f1, if black plays, let's say, queen c3, then everything happens with tempo for white. Knight e2, queen a5, black loses too much tempos with this queen. Black needs to develop. It is true that he got the pawn for this maneuvering and delaying the development, but this is the pawn which you should not take. After rook b1, the ideas with rook b5, annoying the queen on a5, it would not be great to play this position with black pieces. Queen c3 is not very smart. And after king f1, during commentary, we thought that knight d7 would make perfect sense. Instead, knight c6 was played, but Jan was insisting on knight d7, and rightly so. It is probably more solid to have knight on d7 and follow the plan with bishop d6 and short castle, or after h6 long castle. Let's see what would happen if white played rook h3, bishop d6 and queen c2. I like this move. It does not allow black to castle short, so h6 should be played, bishop d2 and short castle. If long castle, then I don't like for black the move h5, fixes the structure on the king side. And if you're gonna play in the center with the idea of rook he8, knight f3 and e5, then the problem for black would be that after e5, f5 square is pretty weak. This is why h5 was very strong. It fixed the structure, so you can play g6 without giving up the pawns. And after e5, knight h4, we have the square for the knight. Knight goes to f5, and I think that this is definitely very pleasant position for white. So after bishop d2, another way to continue this game for black is short castle. g4, of course, if you said A, you have to follow the B as well. So after g4, e5, I was taught if they are attacking you on the king side or queen side, you have to break through in the center to create some of the counterplay. And this is very logical to play e5, bishop f5, bishop c6, g5, h5, and rook e3. Very double-edged, complicated position. To be honest, I don't know which side I would choose, but definitely none of the sides are worse. It is needed to have some plan in this position and not to lose any tempos, but white is pretty much advanced on the king side. Though this knight is still on g1, we have to do something about it. Black is annoying white in the center with e5, But for now, after ed5, cd5, white would be very happy to get this one, as our bishop will be opened and we would have great center. Another problem for black is this queen on a5, which is a bit misplaced. The queen does not belong there. It is very double-edged position, but very playable as well. So after knight d7, we could get such complicated positions, but after king f1, knight c6 was played. A little bit of surprise not to go for knight d7 and close the diagonal for bishop on b7. And after rook b1, I think that now it is white who has the initiative. Rook b1 emphasizes the bad placement of the queen on a5, because this queen is gonna have big problems if rook b8, queen c2, rook c1, bishop c1, something like this happens. We were very surprised to see move f6. During commentary, we could not understand what was wrong with the move h6. But after h6, bishop d2, nothing dramatic, nothing very quick happens. But after bishop d2, black should play something, maybe something like long castle. If bishop d6, another advantage of having the rook on b1 is that we have c5. After c5, it's definitely clear that white is the one who is playing for advantage. After bishop d2, another move which I considered is queen a2, to be greedy and say, I don't care about the development, I want to grab as many pawns as possible. But after rook a1, queen b2, there is a very strong rook a4 with the idea of knight e2, bishop c1, or bishop c1, knight e2. You cannot play, for example, move like bishop e7, because after knight e2 castle, there is bishop c1, which traps the queen. Nor knight a5 or nor knight a5 can be played because of bishop c1, queen c3, and knight e2 traps the queen once again. So a lot of threats for black to handle. After rook a4, knight d4 is the only move. C takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop e3, queen d7, and knight f3. This is the position where the queen is safe, but black gave us a piece for that. It is true that black has 3 pawns, but we have a strong piece play. And after long castle and king e2, I do think that this is a big advantage for white. So after h6, bishop d2, another move I considered was long castle. And after long castle, there is a move a4, not allowing the queen to escape with queen a3, queen e7. And the threats of rook b5 or just simple development, knight f3, knight e2, or rook h3 gives white an advantage. So after rook b1, f6 was played, and after f6, bishop d2, long castle followed shortly. Long castle is a little bit of inaccuracy. It was needed to get this queen out of the bad square a5. We definitely see that yes, white made very big decisions, having the king on f1, which means that we cannot castle anymore, not developing these 2 guys here and playing on the queen side. But for it was worth it because the queen is very powerful piece, we know, and white with tempos is following the queen to trap. Rook b5, bishop c1, knight e2, huge threats. So it was needed probably to play queen a3, queen h5. Big decision, because after queen h5, you don't want to play king e7 or d7, but it is possible to play g6, take on g6, take on g6, queen h8, queen a2, rook d1, and bishop a6. Definitely a compensation for black. Knight f3, bishop c4, and king g1. Long castle, and I would think that black definitely has a compensation for the exchange, but white is also the one who is playing for an advantage. After queen a3, another move could be queen c2, but long castle would be played, because after bishop h7, we cannot take this pawn. It is poisoned pawn, because after f5, the bishop on h7 is trapped. Bishop d2, long castle, a4. A very strong move, not allowing black queen to escape anymore via queen a3, queen e7. And rook b5, c5, everything is in the air. e5. The rule I mentioned, if you're attacked on the side, you have to break in the center. After e5, a very good move followed. For example, moves like knight e5 wouldn't make any sense after bishop e2, knight f7, just c5, and rook b5 is coming. So after a4, e5, and here white has a very interesting choice. One was rook h3, which was not played in the game. In the game was played c5. After rook h3, of course, the idea is that we could not play, let's say, something like rook b5 directly. After rook b5, queen a6, and let's say c5. It doesn't make any sense, because it takes d4. This guy is not protected, and we have to do something about it. So this is prophylactic move. Rook h3, protecting the bishop and having some ideas with rook b5, c5, d5, having something like this in his mind. E takes d4, c takes d4, bishop b4. This is the only way black can hold this position, and d5 was the move I suggested in the live commentary, but I failed to see after bishop d4, rook b5, queen a6 that I could take on c6, bishop c6, queen d2, and we have the position where white has extra piece. If black decides to take on b5, after a b5, rook, queen a1, we have queen e1, and two pieces for the rook and the pawn, but these pawns are very weak. Also, light squared bishop is very strong because the light squares are weak, and b5 pawn is the pride of this position because it fixes all queenside. So this is winning for white, but after queen d2, queen a4 can be played, rook b1, and queen c4. 4 pawns for the sacrificed piece. Rook c1, queen d5, check, taking these queens off the game, and rook hc3. I would consider this position to be slightly better for white, because piece is a piece, as pawn is a pawn, piece is a piece as well. And the structure is kind of fixed. We need to get our knight into the game, but it definitely does not mean that this position is lost or very bad for black. Rook h3 was indeed very interesting move. Instead, c5 was played, and after c5, bishop c5. Great move, allowing rook b5. We know that we cannot take d takes c5, because after rook d3 we will be in a very big trouble. So after c5, bishop c5, rook b5 was played, queen a6 and rook h3. Now there are huge ideas of trapping the queen, taking the bishop. It is super complicated. If you asked me without engine, it looked like white is doing great. Is it true that white is doing great? We don't know yet. Because there is bishop d4. There is always some solution to such positions where you have Levon Aronian and Ding Liren. Two superstars. After bishop d4, it is clear that we cannot take on d4 back. Not because of knight d4. Knight d4 would run into rook b2 and oopsie, the queen is trapped. b5, a b5, queen e6 is only way to save this queen, and after queen a4, huge things are going on the queen side and it does not look good for black at all. After knight d4, another way for white to continue is to take the e5 pawn. b5 should be played, take, and rook e1. This looks very winning for white. So after knight, bishop d4, c d4, rook d4 has to be played so that I don't have any ideas. Let's say rook b3 would not be possible because, first of all, a4 pawn is hanging, not rook a4, but queen a4. But also moves like rook d3, and rook d8 first. Let's say something like queen e2, rook d3, queen d3, taking, and bishop a6 wins for black. So after bishop d4, bishop e2 is a very strong reply. Keeping all options open. Now d4 bishop is hanging and we want to move this rook somewhere where we can trap the queen. So after bishop e2, this was the moment where Ding Liren had to get together, focus and find bishop a8, not rook d6, but bishop a8. This is a very tough move to find. We all know that backward moves are very tough to find, and after bishop a8, when you see this move, you understand that, of course, this is the move that should come first to your mind, but it is not so. It has big advantages, that it clears the way for the queen, which is very much needed. And if we get queen b7, bishop a8, the battery on the h1 a8 diagonal will be very dangerous. But finding bishop a8, the backward move, leaving this bishop on d4, having all threats open and everything is very complicated. It's very difficult. We should not blame Ding Liren not to find bishop a8. It's definitely a computer move. He played more human rook d6, which was very bad and gave Levon Aronian super chances to convert this game into a point. First, let's take a look at bishop a8. Why it is so great? Because after rook b2, queen b7, c takes d4, knight takes d4, we have an extra piece, but we have a threat on g2. Rook g3, rook d7, knight f3, taking on e2, queen e2, and rook h d8. Very double-edged, very complicated play. White has an extra piece, but for that, black has 3 pawns. Nothing yet is clear. I think that this position remains very messy, and I would just say that it's very unclear and double-edged. I don't know which side I would choose if I were to choose. I think I would choose still white, because for black it's pretty difficult. You don't want to advance these pawns yet because it will become weakness, and still piece is a piece. But bishop a8 was definitely the strongest move in this position. If we took on d4, knight d4 is the move now to be played, because after rook d4, knight f3, rook d6 and rook e5 would be very annoying. Queen b7, just rook e3, and we have now extra piece and 2 pawns. Black has 2 pawns, which is not enough compensation. So we have to notice that after rook d6, rook a5 is not the move, not because of queen b7 and bishop a6, but just because of queen a5, bishop a5, rook d1, queen d1, and knight a5. White would be 3 pawns down, and it's definitely time to resign in this position. Rook d6 instead was played. Did I cover that after cd4, knight d4 should be played, and rook a5, I think I didn't cover this yet. After rook a5, the very strong move which saves black here is not queen a5 or queen b7. We cannot play queen b7 anymore because bishop a6 wins the queen, the same ideas. But we have a counter attack, a sacrifice. Bishop g2, king g2, queen b7, with a check. We don't have time for bishop a6, king h2, and b takes a5 with a big advantage for black. So rook d6, more human way to continue play this position. After rook d6, now Levon had a big chance to convert this position into something big. If you look at the position, you know all the ideas, but you still need to have this understanding what is better, why it is better, why do I need my pieces on that exact squares, what are the differences. Of course, first to my mind, or I don't know, to maybe to anybody's mind, would come the move which was played in the game, rook b1. You would not think about rook b2 because somehow it feels that it's not protected there. It does protect another piece on d2, but the rook itself, it's not protected. So you would feel like, why I have to go on b2 when I can go on b1? Which is more important to defend, the bishop or the rook? Rook is higher in value, so that's why rook b1 comes to mind. But rook b2 is a move of the game, because the difference between rook b1 and rook b2 is huge. After queen a5, c takes d4, queen takes d4. Now white is able to take this pawn on e5 because the bishop on d2 is protected. Knight e5, knight f3, rook e1, rook e8, sorry, and king g1. White somehow manages to consolidate to get all his pieces into the play, and this is the position where we say piece is a piece. And this would be a great chance for Levon Aronian to spot, but he did not spot it. And it was amazing. We were commenting and we were both like, oh, rook b2 is there, rook b2, but he played rook b1. Rook b1. Was it the move which gave away everything? Not really. Because after rook b1, queen a5, Levon played again rook b5. And we were like, oh my god, this is so savage, this is so evil. First to repeat moves, give hopes to your opponent, and then after rook b5, queen a6, play rook, not b1, but rook b2. But it did not happen. It didn't happen in the game. After rook b5, we were a bit confused if queen a6 was the only move. So we tried to search moves like bishop c3. And it was like, ooh, this is a big blow. Did Levon miss bishop c3? Does it happening? Is it happening? What is happening at all? Because if we take the queen on a5, then after rook d2, queen b1, bishop a5, black has amazing compensation for the queen. A rook, bishop, and 3 pawns, more than enough for the queen. This is definitely not what would happen after bishop c3, because now white has an amazing counter attack or defense. I don't know how to call this move. I don't know how to name it, but it is rook d3. And this is like, wow, what is going on? Why would we play rook d3? What is the idea of rook d3? The idea of rook d3 is that this queen is still on a5 and it's still trapped. You can do anything. You can't do anything about it. So after rook d3, we are just closing this important d file. And after rook d3, bishop d2, we will take now on a5, bishop a5, and we have an important check. Which means that after king b8, we will take the pawn on g7, and after rook d8, we're gonna take another pawn on h7. This looks definitely winning for white because now rook bishop and a pawn is not enough for the queen, as we have the passed pawn. Big chance, but what we got rook b5, queen a6, rook b1, queen a5, rook b5, queen a6, repetition. And it was like, wow, what happened? What was this all about? Did Levon think he was worse, or what he did not like? But of course we cannot judge players. They play for so long. It's very easy to sit here, commentate, and play everything, all kinds of things, with having engine on the best helper ever, which is recommending you the best moves, and you feel very smart saying that this should have been played here, but this is not the case. When you're on the board, you don't have any help. You are there, only you, sitting and solving the problems of the play and of the game. We also should not forget the psychological factor that maybe it is not that nice to play against the certain opponent. Maybe you're fine with the draw. Maybe you don't see anything concrete and you think that, yeah, this is the logical outcome of the position where everything is very messy, and then somehow players or even engine is finding the way to make a draw with perpetual or threefold repetition. This was the case. We don't know what he missed and what he thought, but definitely we're not here to judge him. Both players played an amazing game, gave us a lot to comment about and to think about, and we are looking for the second round. Thanks for watching, thanks for being here, see you soon.